time about this central
Yeah.
problem, and they were just completely head in the sand about it.
Yeah, there was, I mean, there is enough real there's enough real discourse surrounding Joe Biden's, or there was enough real discourse surrounding Joe Biden's like mental faculties. Sound off so I can see if your audio, I can hear you or not.
Yeah, can you hear me? 1, 2,
Oh,
3, 4,
perfect.
5.
Okay, you are not a boomer at all, man. I don't know why you said that, because like
I was worried. I mean, I had to download Discord for this. That's how out of touch I am with this.
no. Discord is weird. Don't worry about it. But thank you so much for coming on. You have been this is a bit of a I told you so moment for you, as well as some others, in terms of like Joe Biden being received in a certain way by like the broader electorate. Yeah. And I just wanted to talk to you about that. And I wanted to talk to you about like how dynamic this race has been so far, almost overnight, and how things changed. But if you want to give a little bit of your background to the people that are in this community that maybe don't read the New York Times, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, I appreciate you having me on. My name is Astead. I joined the New York Times in 2018. I was at the Boston Globe before that, and I've really been someone who's been focused on trying to cover elections in different ways. You know, when I came to the Times, that was after 2016, where there was a real sense that political journalism had messed stuff up. Leading into that election, you mostly had mainstream political journalism missed the Republican primary, missed the Democratic primary and Bernie's energy, and then obviously not point people to the correct result with Trump's win in 2016. And so I was working locally at the Boston Globe as a city council reporter during that time. And I remember telling myself, like, if I am ever in these positions, I'm going to try to like include more voices, talk to different types of people, and actually reflect the way politics is being experienced on the ground rather than kind of amongst the insiders. And so when I came to the Times, that was really my job. I like covered the Democratic primary with Warren and Harris and Biden and all the others. But really from the basis perspective, I go to Trump rallies a lot and like do things about ways that that conservatism is kind of shifting on the ground. And then I started the Run Up, which is the Times Politics podcast in 2022, which was really trying to take that stuff in audio form.
We call it hogwash here, by the way. Just sorry to cut you off, but it's my favorite thing to do, at least, is like I love watching Republicans. I mean, we call it hogwash. You don't have to obviously do that, but like they are very interesting and fun to observe and even interact with. Personally, I love that. You know,
totally.
I like that.
Like I was always like, I didn't want to just be in one type of place. So like I make sure that we went to a Jason Aldean concert 6 months ago to ask people about his song, Try That in a Small Town, that was like blowing up on the Republican side.
Oh yeah.
Like I try to go to rallies, I try to go to like places where people are, and that includes D and R. And so that's what we tried to do in the podcast. That's what led us to all of this age stuff.
Yeah. So by your estimation, do you feel like the Republicans were the only people, for the most part, talking about like Biden's like cognitive abilities diminishing in terms of like coverage from other aspects of like other places in mainstream media, with the exception of like Fox News, obviously?
Right. I mean, like you saw Republicans driving that storyline definitely for the last 3-4 years. So much so that a lot of people ran away from it thinking, oh, this is Republican misinformation. This is them trying to brand Joe Biden as old. But the other place I heard it from was regular people. Like every time we would even talk to people about the prospect of next election, if we weren't in like a specifically Democratic or DC place, everyone would be like, well, I think Donald Trump's kind of wild, but Joe Biden's really old. And so it was really clear to us that this was the storyline to follow, because the thing that we were hearing was that like most people didn't want either candidate. And so while Democrats were acting like that was just the thing that was happening on the Republican side, I was like, well, the thing that feels like we're hearing is mutual dislike, not really just one. And so that's the reason we kept asking them those questions.
Yeah, which they kind of covered it as well, the double haters phenomena. Like I think that was how they talked about it, and it was for a multitude of different reasons. But I think like for me it got to like an unavoidable place during the uncommitted voter campaigns. Obviously, a lot of that was because of Gaza, but I think a big part of that also was Biden's age. And the fact that like the Democratic Party was, or Democratic Party's like base of voters was looking for a different alternative, and it was so obvious, and yet like I didn't see enough like media coverage on that either. from that aspect. And it was more so just like kind of brushed aside, even though the margins that we saw in especially key states for the Democratic Party's success was so significant. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of voters in certain states like that voted for anybody but Biden in the primaries. And obviously, I kept trying to explain to people, like, the real uncommitted voters just simply don't vote. We have a plurality in almost every election that doesn't vote for either party at all, that doesn't vote at all, right? That are eligible to vote. And so that, you know, these people that are going into the Democratic primary, they are the most active base in the Democratic primary. So it's like, it's probably going to be like, obviously, maybe not 10x, but I don't know what the exact math equation would look like, but the numbers for the general are going to reflect something much, much worse than the margins that you saw in the primaries, which alone were enough for Joe Biden to lose, because there were more people voting against Joe Biden in the Democratic Party's primaries than the number of voters that Joe Biden won those states on. So that should have been immediate. Like, I mean, I think that the Democratic Party should have, you know, Joe Biden should have been the bridge candidate, and he should have perhaps maybe even had a stronger vice president, or, you know, even with Kamala Harris, in my opinion, shouldn't have made her do side missions that were genuinely unfavorable, like sending her to Guatemala to be like, don't come to America.
It speaks to how much they weren't seeing this scenario play out. Like, I did a big story on her, and I can say that, like, for the White House, they were not working under the assumption that she would be the natural heir. And if they were, they would have done stuff differently. Harris did not want that assignment at Guatemala, of the root cause on the border. Joe Biden made her take it. And then partially, like, that was some of the uncomfort. But it speaks to your point about the age denialism overall. Like, they could not set her up differently, partially because they weren't really acknowledging the biggest problem that they had, which is that when most Americans saw them, they didn't think that would be a kind of 8-year option. And it's really crazy to me because, like, having been there in 2020, like, age was a huge part of people's concerns about Joe Biden from the start. It was part of the reason candidates like Pete had a moment, or even Klobuchar had a moment in New Hampshire, Warren and all of those type of people.
Castro was one of the first people.
All of that stuff was so litigated at the time. For them to act like, oh, he's gotten 4 years older, but no one cares anymore, was always really crazy to me. And it's such a denial of, like, our whole ecosystem. Like, there's a thing that happens in political journalism where people act. This happened. I think the best example is after the debate. People are like, "Oh, the debate was a bad moment, but he hasn't had a big gaffe since." But meanwhile, a lot of people saw that video of him talking to the wrong woman, and it's somewhat looking like his wife, and not. Like, people see all of these kind of like mini viral clips of him walking up the stairs and like looking rough doing it. I'm like, people have been reminded even in this time about this central problem, and they were just completely head in the sand about it.
Yeah, there is enough real discourse surrounding Joe Biden's, or there was enough real discourse surrounding Joe Biden's, like, mental faculties, that even like fake stuff would get play, and it would just pile on. And I don't think, like, anybody addressed that at all, like, or anybody in the campaign side was, like, even looking at that. And it also seemed like they were just allergic to looking at polls at all, until the very last moment. And I found it rather funny because it was very Trumpian in many ways. Like, you have this, like, almost narcissistic moment with a sheltered person complaining about leaks and trying to constantly present a different image, of competence, even though, like, people obviously are looking at it and going, yeah, no, I don't see this competence at all. And unlike Trump, there is no solid base of cultists for Biden, which is why I think
it's a huge difference.
Yeah. So, but obviously, let's talk about the other side of the political equation now. It wasn't just the Biden campaign and maybe some members of the political media that was refusing to recognize that this age issue was going to be a death blow. It was actually the Republicans who were, ironically, for the past 4 years, consistently hammering on the point that, like, Biden is just incompetent. His brain is doo-doo. It's not working. But then it seems like they had no alternative for the replacement, and they've just been flailing for the past week now.
I was at the RNC, and I can say with certainty they did not see this coming at all. Their whole plan, their whole the what was informing their mass confidence over the last several months was the idea that the Democrats were so ignoring the core question of Biden's age that it frankly allowed them to cakewalk through November. Now, I mean, maybe that may have overstated from where the evidence was, but we knew that Trump was in the stronger position than
Yeah.
Biden, and they frankly just thought that that would be enough. And so I think it's really true that they've been caught flat-footed on this point. They really haven't come up with like a clear story to tell about Harris. And more than anything, I think a lot of Republicans have been fooled into the belief of thinking that Donald Trump is a strong general election candidate, when that was never really true. He was only looking that way because he was dealing with Joe Biden, who was ignoring a bigger kind of unfixable problem. But everything that we see, and even our own reporting on the road, like the strongest coalition in politics is still the anti-Trump one. Like he is
Yeah.
not popular among independents. He is not popular among swing voters. All of that stuff in trials actually does put people off. There was a sense after January 6th that he was going to kind of go away, and a lot of people haven't forgotten about that. It's just that they weren't being activated on the Democratic side because the party was letting the egos of, 20, 30 people refuse to really allow them to tap into that. Now, what we've seen over the last 4 days is, of course, that energy is still there because Donald Trump still remains unpopular. They just needed a vessel to channel it through.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is no clear indication of Donald Trump's very apparent ceiling, which Joe Biden
Yeah.
also had one, obviously, because these are
Mhm.
both people that have uniquely been president at this point. One is the incumbent, the other one was the former president, right? They had maxed out their name recognition and people had made up their minds on them. And there's no greater demonstration of Donald Trump's ceiling than the polling that was conducted after he was shot at. And even I was shocked at like
Yeah.
the lack of momentum. And I think it
Yeah.
played a role because like he also messed up the RNC delivery where he was just
Absolutely.
like, oh, I'm going to do unity. I'm going to be more moderate.
And I would say the VP pick aligns with that too.
Yeah, exactly. Like having JD Vance, who is like an objectively bad, unimaginably unpopular, and also unsuccessful politician as his VP pick. And when I say this, this isn't just like, my own personal estimation. I mean, he underperformed Trump and the governor by like significant margins in the state of
Absolutely.
Ohio. You're not supposed to, if you're like, oh, I really want to lock in Ohio, which is a red state at this point, firmly red. So that's already a silly pick. But then beyond that, if you're like, oh, I want someone who is going to, show the rest of the country that I am a moderate person, you probably wouldn't be going with the guy who's like a VC funded guy. He's a hedge fund guy who is unpopular in his own state, by less popular than Donald Trump, who also is like has mountains of opposition research stacked against him that can be deployed at any moment.
Donald Trump had done a lot of like work to kind of reposition himself on abortion specifically as an issue, and JD Vance blows that up. Just because he's been so restrictive, he's embraced the kind of national ban, he's against stuff like IVF. They're already having to roll back some of the work that they had done to try to recalibrate themselves on this thing. And then, of course, that's an issue that Harris, I think even more so than Biden, is uniquely suited to exploit. Like, think back to that debate. Donald Trump's answer on abortion was really bad. But what was worse was Joe Biden's response. He started talking about illegal immigration. He was kind of rambling, all of that stuff. We know that if you run that back in the Trump versus Harris debate, she is ready for that answer in a different type of way. And so I'm like, what Democrats were doing to themselves was also not allowing them to optimize the issues that they are best on, because they had a candidate who was not only old, but was not even a natural messenger on abortion, doesn't like saying the words, and that is their biggest issue. And so this could come down to in November. I mean, there's ways that, I've reported on Harris from a lot of different angles, but all of that stuff is clarified now. I think this is going to be a candidate who basically says Project 2025, abortion, and, and that might be it. That might be the whole terms of what they try to make November about.
So, I mean, that's like, if that is the case, then it's, I mean, that would require, I think, like a lot of PR and a lot of charisma to be able to drive that conversation. I don't know if Kamala Harris is going to be able to do that. We'll see. I mean, it seems like she's capable of doing that, and she has started on that front. One thing I wanted to point to, by the way, is obviously that like one of the narratives that the Republican Party is suggesting is that this is anti-democratic, and they're trying to claim that like the Democratic Party actually behaving like a competent party for once in at least like all of the years that I've spent covering politics. In a shocking display of competence where they actually responded to the voter pressure. I know that much of the conversation has been dominated by like what the donors were saying, but like obviously this was a unique moment where the donors actually aligned with some of the establishment Democrats and also with the majority of voters. And they're trying to make this narrative stick. Like they're trying to pick apart, you know, almost like a Bernie Buster style coalition out of like Biden dead enders, not recognizing that Biden has no ideological fissure with the establishment with the establishment Democrats at all. So like obviously all of the Biden supporters were supporting Biden mostly because, you know, they like the Democratic Party. They are ride or die Democratic Party hardliners. So that is reflected in the massive influx of donations. That's reflected in the polling, the new polling that came out from New York Times. I wanted to point to here. Trump is at 48 and Harris is at 47 among likely voters nationwide. And I mean, this is like immediately Kamala Harris is obviously performing better than Biden was. Biden had a downward trajectory. Kamala Harris seemingly is picking up steam. Do you think that is a consequence of a lot of the positive coverage that she's garnered, and that like she will be able to lean on that momentum and activate different bases of support for the Democratic Party that have firmly been in the double hater category? Or do you think that like, go ahead. Sorry.
I just think that like people were desperate for a way out of the choice that they had. And so a lot of the energy that I think we're seeing from her is driven by excitement of a party that, to your point, reacted to what was a majority public opinion, even if it took them a year and a half to acknowledge it. I mean, the numbers on people's satisfaction with Biden's decision are crazy. It's like 90% among Democrats, 85% among independents. And I think that is some of the like exasperation that is flowing towards Harris. I mean, the Biden campaign over the last couple years has just treated the fact that people weren't engaged in this election as just a fact, right? But that fact was responsive to the choices that people had. And so I think you're going to get more engagement. And she doesn't even have to be the sole driver of the message of, we think about Project 25, abortion, or things that Democrats want to push. They are also unleashing surrogates who were nowhere to be found because they didn't want to be associated with Biden. All of a sudden, these Democrats look differently because they have a whole roster of people who are kind of in the shadows because Biden made it kind of untenable for them to do. So I think all of that stuff is there. And I think also, to your point, Donald Trump is coming out of what should be a good period for him. But from the RNC to what happened in Pennsylvania, this should be a moment where we are seeing his kind of polling highs. And Harris still probably will receive a bump from things like the DNC, from choosing a running mate, from things like that. And so you do see the upside for her that didn't exist with him. Biden was doing fine among your hardline Democrats that you're talking about, the type of people who vote in most in a primary. That kind of hardcore set was with him. Where they were struggling was the marginal Democratic voter. When you get younger, when you get non-college, when you get people of color, all of that type. And all of those groups are where she has upside that he didn't.
Yeah, it goes back to a familiar territory, I think, for the Democratic Party in terms of the base of support that they've always relied on, whether it be voters of color, whether it be young voters, Hispanic voters in general. Even though Trump has made genuine leeway, that's
going to be the huge battleground.
Yeah. Like Trump has made genuine leeway in Hispanic voters. I mean, he was beating Biden, I believe, by 9 points on Hispanic voters, and Kamala Harris is being beat currently by Trump by 2 points. Now, obviously, that calculation is very different for a place like Florida versus a place like, I think, New Mexico and Nevada, where I think the youth vote is also almost completely aligned with the Hispanic vote, where they are interested in infinitely more progressive policies versus obviously Florida, where Cuban, Venezuelan populations are significantly more right wing. and maybe also Texas as well. So
Mhm.
I suspect that there are two key issues. I think you have the Sun Belt and you have the Rust Belt, right? In terms of the Rust Belt, I think Michigan maybe not. Michigan maybe isn't a must-win state to the same degree as Pennsylvania, but I think it's a pretty significant state. And I think that Kamala Harris, like, not even changing narratively from shifting away narratively from Joe Biden in the way that he has maintained Israel during the past 9 months is going to be a legitimate problem. And I don't think she will be able to win Michigan if she continues along with the same exact, like, almost identical Biden style narratives. Like, she came out with a statement earlier today talking about, like, the flag burners.
It's going to be a big thing to watch. Yeah.
Yeah. And for the Sun Belt, I think specifically for, like I said, New Mexico, maybe even Arizona to a certain degree. And I want to hear your assessment on this. I feel like the narrative of capitulating to right-wing framing on immigration and not really combating it, when if we look at the last election, which was also fought on the immigration boundaries, Joe Biden was actually a lot closer to Donald Trump in terms of his favorability on immigration than he is now, because the Democrats basically dropped the more progressive approach to immigration and capitulated to right-wing framing on the matter. And I fear that is also kind of toxic for the younger Hispanic base of support within the party.
Yeah, I'll deal with the map first and then the issues. I think you're really right that Harris has a wider map than Joe Biden did, of course. Joe Biden was almost principally at this point thinking about those upper Midwestern states, the Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and hoping to cobble together a path through 270 on that front. And it should be said that part of that was his erosion with people of color, with young people. And because those states trended older, wider, more college educated, he was doing better in those places than we think about some belts in Georgia. She improves immediately. We've seen polling improve margins in Georgia or improve margins in Arizona. That should give them more confidence. But to your point, that is going to be an interesting, tenuous relationship to watch. One of the areas that some Harris allies have signaled is that they would hoping. Well, she has sought to create a different tone of empathy for Palestinians than has come from Biden. And there's been some leaks that have tried to say that the folks around Harris were kind of signaling that she would have a different kind of tone, even if that didn't reflect in literal different policy. That Selma speech that she gave, which was endorsing a kind of temporary ceasefire as part of that. I think that pressure is going to ramp up on.
Even her team, like, very cleverly leaking that, like, she actually wanted a permanent ceasefire, but then they, like, changed the narrative to make it seem like it was a temporary.
So all of that stuff was those signals, and I think that pressure on her is going to ramp up. So we're going to get a sense to see if she's going to try to signal some distance from Biden, because I think that's going to be a huge deal. But I think immigration, they can't run from this. This is going to be where Republicans try to most focus on. And because of the kind of, we can say that it wasn't a technical border czar position, she's kind of placed in the middle of here. The House voted today to condemn Kamala Harris's handling of the border, and 7 Democrats voted with the Republicans. A lot of those were those Latino Democrats on the border in places like Texas. And so I'm saying that's going to be a big question, is if she can reverse the favorability on that issue, or if other issues just start mattering more. We were in Arizona for the show a couple months ago, and everyone kind of agrees. If this comes down to immigration, Donald Trump has a better shot. But they also have an abortion rights referendum on the ballot in November, which is making that issue just as much of a priority for people as immigration. And if they're neck and neck, if there's a different reason to motivate people, then you see the chances for Democrats all across the board. But they can't run from Gaza. They cannot run from immigration, because I do think those are going to be the 2 areas where people are looking for her to set a more affirmative vision. And she hasn't really done that yet. And so that pressure will come.
Okay, I want to run this by you. I was a big critic of the crime hysteria narratives that set in through all the way from Sinclair Broadcasting to even, mainstream media, even to the New York Times a little bit, in terms of
I won't disagree with you.
In terms of how much panic was happening. And now that's obviously cast aside a little bit. Crime statistics come out all the time. Everyone is saying, well, what's going on? What's the reason why Americans are so fearful of crime when in fact they keep reporting that their own personal towns and their own personal states are actually much safer, but it's elsewhere. Crime is happening elsewhere. Now, I believe that this hysteria was obviously backed by the media for the most part, and the apps like Nextdoor and Citizen or whatever and Ring, that was like, because crime is a constant issue. It's impossible to just have zero crime. That's never going to happen. But like when it's in front of you all the time, because it's such an emotional thing, you just have a tendency to assume that it's happening a lot worse than ever before. And beyond that, there's also so much that people associate with crime, homelessness specifically, so much poverty that makes people think, oh, crime is all around me at all times. Like I see homeless people everywhere. And those are the two reasons, in my opinion, that there was this hysteria. And now I feel, and not even now, but just every 4 years, every 2 years, that hysteria changes to immigration. Donald Trump has tried to repackage this immigration conversation alongside crime and angled it from the perspective of national security, which is kind of new, I would say. It's never been to this degree. Immigration used to be an issue of the economy. They're coming and taking our jobs was the that was a common meta. That was a common narrative on immigration. And since 2016, it seems like the Republican Party has completely adopted the position that like immigration is not just about the economy. As a matter of fact, it's actually a national security problem. And there's a very scary reality when you look at polls on this issue, specifically when you have 60+% of Americans saying mass deportations are actually favorable, like a favorable policy. You have Donald Trump talking about, a term I will not use, but Operation W word, and with positive terms, saying this mass deportation of 1.3 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans and Latin Americans from the United States of America in the 50s was actually a good thing.
It had signs at the RNC, mass deportations now.
Yeah. And I think that the Democrats have completely dropped the ball over the course of the past 4 years, especially by not trying to tackle this issue at all and provide a counter narrative to it and address that it's like it is born out of hysteria. Because when you look at the data, and I do see it now with NPR and New York Times and other places, like finally addressing the lack of truth and lack of data available to suggest that like undocumented migrants are actually responsible for crime at a higher rate than natural born U.S. citizens, and actually talking about how the data suggests that it's the exact opposite, right? And that's like I would say that is like relatively new in terms of the media coverage, and I have not seen a single Democrat, with maybe the exception of AOC when she was on my broadcast when we were watching Donald Trump talk in the Bronx, ever bring that up. And without any sort of serious counter narrative to that lie, like the Democrats are demonstrably going to get destroyed on the immigration front. So this long, convoluted question I have for you is, do you think the Democrats have an opportunity to be able to reframe the message and the narrative on immigration, or is it far too late, or do they even have the interest to reframe the narrative on immigration?
Yeah, because I'm kind of the latter. They have the opportunity. I don't know if they want to. I mean, I go back to the 2020 Democratic primary, and what they would say about Donald Trump and immigration was very much condemning things like separating of kids at the border, or condemning kind of language or rhetoric towards immigrants. But they were not laying out a vision of how they think immigration should function here, and more so than just a defense of the broad value that, frankly, they've stepped away from a little bit. When we think about crime, and I think you're really right to say that Republicans have really used this as an entry point to everything, immigration as a crime. Not just the economy, but about crime. But also, I would say fentanyl is another piece for them. They say like, the immigrants are coming and they're bringing fentanyl from China, and that's the reason you have a drug crisis in your community. Like,
which
that's
again
huge
is a lie.
Republican
like
narrative.
It's so insane. The Department of Homeland Security has never. Like, they also bring this data up regularly under the Trump administration, under the Biden administration. And if you look at the DHS data, it shows that like drug trafficking that is happening at the border is coming in from regular points of entry, like either being shipped in shipping containers, or American citizens with chopped up cars are driving cars filled with fentanyl over the border. It's not happening with like abuelas coming in and like sneaking
Yeah, but
fentanyl
that is
under
there.
their.
That they are fully into that. And the thing I would say though is like, in my experience in media, and I do think you're right to call out the media narratives on this front, you could feel the backlash from 2020 to 2021 because I think the hysteria that you're talking about was frankly a media reaction to what they felt was an embrace of a like a defund, overly progressive criminal justice
Yeah.
reform language that happened in the George Floyd summer. And then you saw people just, I think, reaching and grabbing for kind of anecdotes to respond to that. When in reality, even as someone who reported through the 2020 moment, you know, when we think about Black and Latino communities, they were never united on the idea of even defund or something like that. Those were open conversations about what you should do to react to a problem. But the way it was kind of reported as like fully in one direction led to this media backlash in another direction. Where I think by the time in 2021, we were cherry picking crime stats to try to say something as true. And I also think it was so regional, you know, in places like New York, there was a real reaction to crime, and I think an increase in migrant, you know, Eric Adams describes as a migrant crisis. There is a reaction to that that I think was growing in these places, but then you have some of that written as a fact nationally when that isn't a fact nationally, nor does it square with we know what the statistics are. And so I do think we need to check ourselves as like a media, as like a reporting on these fronts, because even in the election context, I need to make sure that like what is talked about here is not necessarily what is being talked about elsewhere, and even the border or immigration is experienced very differently in very different places. And so all of that becomes like really true. But I think to actually answer your question, the Democrats have not shifted their language to kind of defend the like kind of progressive view of immigration on this front because they're not united around that vision.
Yeah.
Like, you know, if you polled the caucus and gave them a secret ballot, I think a lot of people would agree with more Trumpian language around immigration than we may admit, even among the Democratic Party. And part of that is because I think a donor class, a more affluent Democrat, has also become more conservative on those issues in the last 3 or so years. And so I think it's frankly, I don't know where someone like Harris lands as a response to the immigration charges that are going to come from Republicans, because they have conceded the point of the crisis, and
Yeah.
they've conceded the point of like of a thing that we need to deal with in this way. Their only reaction has been, well, Republicans haven't worked with us in Congress, you
Yeah,
know,
that
like,
was
and that's been basically it.
that was insane to me. Like I was losing my mind when I watched that happen when like the supposedly bipartisan bill, which was just a Republican bill. Like Democrats in the past have always played tit for tat on immigration.
Yep.
You get DACA, but then you do like you know, mass apprehension, right?
Right.
Like,
E-verify, all of those type of things. Yeah.
Yeah, like, and there was no tit for tat in this situation. They didn't even want like they were barely advocating for like faster processing, and most of the anti-immigration bill was written with Republican language, with Republican policy measures, and the only benefit that the Democratic Party was going to get from that was going to be, oh, look how hypocritical the Republicans are. They don't actually want to solve this problem, which is like the worst possible instinct you can have. It is almost identical to the we are the party that's going to fund the police narrative that like Joe Biden ran on.
That's a good analogy.
And they keep doing this over and over again. It makes me lose my mind. But I guess I guess you're saying that it's virtually impossible, it seems, to like change course and redirect the narrative on how like immigrants are the soul of this nation type things that the Democrats used to say against Donald Trump when Trump was doing horrifying things at the border.
Yeah, it reminds me of like, you know, I would say I would sum up the Democrats' position as like, you know, the line and you know, like in Hamilton when they say immigrants get the job done and like everyone used to clap and stand, you know, like I feel like that's how they want to feel around the issue. It's like an acknowledgement in like broad terms that says we are somewhat nicer than the other side, but they're not dealing with the brokenness of the system, and they're not trying to make it better,
Yeah.
or even I think more acknowledge the kind of structural unjustness, and they're not at this point I think even against the deportation aspect of it. I mean, we know Obama was doing that in bigger numbers.
Yeah.
But I think what Trump is doing is, prioritized the lack of entry, but this time he's promising to do more on the deportation front. I don't think I have an answer to where Harris or Biden stands on that issue. And so like I think we're gonna get answers to that. And it might my instinct is that it's gonna be more conservative than we think even. Like I think tough prosecutor might extend to
Yeah.
immigration.
I think she's gonna go ultra instinct cop mode. I do suspect that as well, which I am very fearful on. Okay, so there was a couple different things I wanted to ask you about this before I let you go, because and thank you so much for spending time with us today. There was one other aspect that I saw. This was reported in the New York Times. There's a lot of auditioning. This is David Dayen summarizing the point. There's a lot of auditioning going on for Kamala, and it's likely that she's gleefully throwing out bits and pieces. In the same article, it says, I don't see significant differences between what President Biden has fought for and what Vice President Harris will fight for. However, there were some criticisms of the FTC's chair, Lena Khan, who I think is a rising star and has done a phenomenal job overall for the nerds that pay attention to this. I don't think this is like an election related thing for that for the most part, but I think the agencies, well, maybe with Project 2025, actually, federal agencies being competent and actually doing work as opposed to Donald Trump diminishing their power and completely gutting them and putting loyalists in positions of power might actually play a role in the election. But overall, the fact that the New York Times reports, as Vice President Ms. Harris has voiced support for regulating artificial intelligence, but she's expressed skepticism of Ms. Khan's expansive view of antitrust powers, according to a donor who has spoken privately with the VP. That, I think, is a misstep as well.
It's interesting because I think it speaks to the state of play right now. Like when I read that this morning, and I thought, I'm not sure if I take it as fact, but what I do take it on is people see an opportunity to shape a new candidate. And so, if you're a donor, you know that there's a lot. I would say, to your point about not being an election issue, we know that the folks who are most maybe upset by it might be some of those corporate donors who would use their time with the Harris to make that point. But I'm not sure we have a clue on where she falls on these things. I would say, like, this is the uniqueness of her as a prosecutor track for all of these years, is that her career is really built on like accountability, on a kind of reactive sense of policy. She wasn't really getting to root causes. She wasn't really setting an affirmative agenda. We don't know how she would use agencies to kind of shape a vision. And the way that Elizabeth Warren had a full literal list of people, And so I think it's an open terrain when you think about what a Harris-led Democratic Party could look like. And frankly, just as you're that donor who's using that as an opportunity, I think there are progressive groups who can use that as an opportunity, organizing groups who can use that to try to push her in one direction or another. I think that for the next couple months, they're going to want to there's going to be unity forward, right? So it's like I think they're going to try to calibrate themselves and basically the midpoint of everything. But I think that you're going to see a lot more of that public jockeying to get her to commit to something. But she'll have to make some points of distance with Biden. I do think that. And I think maybe this issue is an insider version of that, and Gaza is an outside issue of that. But she's going to have to, in some way, say, what is a Harris-led administration different from a Biden one?
Yeah.
And we don't really know yet.
Yeah, it's concerning seeing some of this stuff, especially. But what you're saying is really important, especially at a time when like almost all the major labor unions have come out and have demanded that the administration change course on Gaza. This happened like last week, and I think that that's a good pressure point.
I'm like, the pressure points are now new, so we should see. I think we're going to see a lot of people get in there. One thing I would say about covering her in her original presidential run is this was some of the things that actually got her in trouble. She was, I don't want to say susceptible to pressure in a just bad way, but she was open to others' ideas.
Yeah.
And so sometimes she would be pulled in one direction or another. And I think in that primary where there were such ideological lanes with Bernie and Warren on one side, Biden, Pete, and Klobuchar on another side. That felt her that came off as inauthentic. She was pulled one
Yeah.
direction or the other. But I'm saying that actually is a I mean, she would argue, I've heard her say this. She would say that's a good governing skill because she's looking to kind of take the information in front of her and make the best decision. In going forward, I think there's going to be big opportunities to try for folks to try to peel off, policy issue or something, unless you know the Democratic Party kind of puts their hooks into her and kind of pushes her in one direction. I'm saying that's going to be interesting to see too. Does she just fold into what Biden would have done, or do we see someone who actually creates a different type of space for
Yeah.
themselves?
Especially when considering like her track record. Obviously, Democrats love presenting themselves as like radical Marxist Leninists under a Trump administration, or like when they don't have any power, you know, her
Yeah.
advocacy for Medicare for all and whatnot, which now the Republicans are trying to use as a line of attack, and even like pairing her with Bernie Sanders, who, historically has been one of the most popular congresspersons in America. So I think that that's like a failure on their part. But I do fear that what you just described is exactly the reason why Kamala Harris will do the classic Democrat thing and be like, no, I'm not for any of these socially progressive policies, which will cut away at the momentum from all of the usual constituencies that she needs to win in order to defeat Donald Trump. Because while Donald Trump is obviously a weak candidate, demonstrably so. I mean, he lost, right? He lost to an objectively old man. Ultimately, it's like the Joe Biden dynamic is very different in terms of like activating or trying to go after the suburban, college educated whites. Like they need to. I think that like she needs to go back to like an almost Obama style strategy. But I fear that she won't do that with any kind of pressure because it's perceived as a weakness. Like one of her weakest points is how liberal she is, right? Like that's the only line of attack they have on her.
Yeah, no, I think this is the thing. Upside does not mean she wins. Upside means the onus is on her in that campaign to realize those things. And so I do think how they end up positioning themselves could either help that case or reintroduce the same problems that some people had with her 4 years ago. And I would also say, like, one thing I have learned, I mean, in covering these people as I get closer is like, you're dealing with operatives who have been trained in a more traditional time. These are conventional operatives for unconventional times, right? And so some of this requires people viewing a candidate who I don't think is the same as Obama or Clinton or Biden, in a moment that's not like those either, and asking, do they create space for them to be themselves? There was a period of time when I was the Warren and Harris reporter for the Globe, and I mean for the Times, and one thing that really came through was like, there were so many questions about how these women were presenting authentically and all of this stuff. But a lot of those same decisions were coming from men who have run campaigns for 20-something years. And we're trying to impose that view onto this one. And so, like, that's the question I kind of have is, are we going to get a version of her that is actually reflective of something different? Or is this the Biden campaign with Kamala Harris as the candidate?
Yeah.
And I don't think that would work, to be honest. Like, I think they have to see that the reason they've arrived at this crisis is because the moment demands something different, and actually figure out what that difference is with this candidate. But I'm not confident. I don't know that they're going to do that.
Yeah,
but that's my read of what is necessary.
The demographic math is damn near the opposite. Like Chuck Schumer once famously said, for every one vote we gain in the for every one vote, every one blue collar vote that we lose in Pennsylvania, we gain 2 in the suburbs. Like that was the math with Biden, and it makes sense with Biden, right? A conservative old white guy that like older voters, more conservative voters can trust, that demonstrates competence, and clearly incompetent, that fell apart regardless. So that was a dead end for them anyway. But with Kamala Harris, it's like dramatically different, if not the opposite. This is supposed to be like a vibrant, dynamic, youthful candidate. I mean, I think she presents very young. She's 59, but she looks, you know, in her 40s, and I think that like aesthetically that matters for voters, especially when compared to Joe Biden and how old he presented. So so we'll see what, you know, we'll see what occurs on that front. But one thing I wanted to ask, is you were closely following these candidates, do you feel like there was any, do you feel like it was more so political posturing and wanting to present herself as a progressive candidate when she was actually signing on a lot of progressive measures when she was a California senator? Or do you think that there's like a genuine ideological lane for her? Because you did mention that she's kind of malleable and sees that as a strength, which is like, again, very Democratic Party to be like, no, I find myself in the center. Almost ironic enough, it's very much like Joe Biden and his entire
a different
career.
view of like how where center is, but a similar, he was kind of doing center in terms of bipartisanship in DC. And I think she was kind of doing center between a overtly liberal, like a moderate liberal and a San Francisco progressive. And she was kind of finding that.
Yeah.
But her Smarter on Crime book, that is like her formative progressive, you know, kind of formative prosecutor book, is a advocacy for the middle, you know, for the liberal middle, for representation as being a way to impact change from the inside, but necessarily working within, but definitely working within the confines of political structure. So like that is who she is. To your point about why was the Medicare for All happening? Why was the kind of progressive flirtations happening? I think like the real answer is like there was a fundamental misread of the electorate by most Democrats going into 2020. And I think they thought, and this has benefited Joe Biden hugely, because they thought that there had been a kind of page turn on some of the traditional issues. And so you were frankly trying to engulf some of Bernie, but one step back, I think. And so that led people to sign up for Medicare for All in that 2019 year into 2018. And she was the first person to do that. And part of that was posturing against what they thought was going to be Bernie, Warren, other people taking them on. And so when she gets in the race, and it becomes very clear that her principal problem was not Bernie Sanders, but was that Joe Biden was sitting on black voters of the South. I think there was a big kind of recalibration among those people who kind of assumed the primary was moving in one direction. The other thing I would be like is it drove her away from her authentic message, right? And so the Bernie race of 2020 always made no sense to me, because if you're a voter who's trying to find the most progressive candidate possible, you're going to vote for Sanders. Like, you're like it was a losing rat race in my opinion. And so the thing, you know, Warren was trying to do an establishment version of that progressivism, but the others were just kind of picking and choosing individual issues, and that was never rounding out a full lane that people could understand and the full story about a candidate that you can understand. And so it didn't surprise me that in the end we fell back with the people who knew their stories most clearly: Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders. As a journalist, when you're asking these people some questions, I know Bernie, Biden, and I would say Warren return back to kind of a core of what they think is wrong in politics. They have even no matter the answer, they know kind of the premise in which they're working from. You never really got that with Harris. You felt her thinking and kind of wheels spinning in real time to try to find what she should say. I don't think that's gonna work this time around. And so, you know, she has a lot of issues that are more naturally in her wheelhouse. I think the Dobbs decision clarified stuff. Like she now can own being a prosecutor because that's easier to do with Trump on the other side. So that stuff is all helpful. But when it comes to immigration, you know, when it comes to some of this stuff, what is going to be the story that she tells about root causes and fixes? That's still where my head is, because she hasn't been answering those throughout her career. She has not answered those questions well.
Yeah. Okay. Last question for you. What do you make of all of the media coverage talking in a state of panic and maybe even like hyperventilating a bit about like black people, specifically black men, voting for Trump? The marginal shift is, I think, indicative of like the Democratic Party's inaction and maybe like taking the black vote for granted. But I do find it rather insane that like people talk about it like Donald Trump is winning the black vote
Yes.
by like
Yeah.
by like majorities or something, and it's always very frustrating to watch. But what do you think about it personally as a journalist?
Yeah, no, I also am somewhat frustrated too. It's always the place I start when this stuff comes up. It's like, yeah, I think if you talk to the Trump campaign, their goal would be maybe like 30-40% of black men. I mean, at the max that they would hope for. And that would still make, even if they were to achieve 30%, that would still make black men the more blue voting demographic than so many other ones. So we're talking about a small group of people.
Yeah.
But have they successfully appealed to that small group of people? And more importantly, have Democrats eroded among this community? Absolutely.
Yeah.
And some of that is changes over time that predate, I think, Joe Biden. There was a drop off since 2012. There's lack of party identification that's more true of young black voters. They're less likely to be religious, which, a lot of those old relationships between black church and Democratic parties were really real. I think overall, we've seen Democrats fall off among people who haven't gone to college more broadly. So some of that
Yeah.
stuff crosses race completely. But I'm like, Donald Trump also makes a specific appeal to a version of masculinity that cuts across races also.
Yes.
And so when we would talk, we had a focus group around black men for our show. And some of the stuff that comes up is the same type of same type of Me Too backlash, or same type of conservative kind of anti-LGBTQ language that we see in a lot of other places that have taken hold among some groups of, men across races. And so it doesn't actually, I'm with you that I don't think it's surprising that we have seen them make a little marginal gain, but I also, it's not meaningless. I would say that Harris, though, creates a new opportunity on this front. That's not to say that misogyny among black male voters doesn't exist. I've heard so much of it when it comes to her candidacy specifically. But I'm saying it creates a different type of upside, energy, and organization among black communities, which I think might bring these people in for different reasons. I thought the way the Biden campaign has talked about its relationship with black voters has been so haughty and has been very, I think, paternalistic for a while. And what the evidence tells us is that they do well among your most committed type of older black Democrats. And that was always where they were most doing well. They were never doing well among sub 40 black voters, even back in 2020.
Oh, so that's actually one thing I wanted to bring up. The only interesting piece of analysis I've seen on this is proximity to the civil rights movement. The further you get away from that, which is obviously one of the most consequential gains made by the Democratic Party for black Americans, the less the further you move away from that generationally, the less likely you are to have any kind of commitment or loyalty to the Democratic Party, because the modern Democratic Party has done nothing for you. And sure, there's always a defensive posture and church networks and everything that you just mentioned, but beyond that, there is no reason for a young black voter to make the calculations about harm reduction that these mythical voters are supposed to be making at all times, which has been a fundamental plank in the Democratic Party's election, their re-election chances every fucking cycle.
They've held black communities at hostage with the same kind of lesser of two evils argument for a long time.
Yeah.
And I think that for a lot of people who are further and further away from the kind of sense that you must vote because of this, because of the ways that the right was earned so recently, that argument was hitting less and less. And that's happened, I think, a couple cycles, and I think was definitely true in this one also. And so it frustrates me though, because, black communities vote for Democrats in disproportionate numbers than any other racial or ethnic group.